Here's what I want in a PS Vita 2. So if you guys didn't know, I have a second channel called Deck Ready where I talk about the Steam Deck and other Windows handhelds that play PC games. And Sony, if you haven't heard, in the past couple years has really gone big into making PC games. So recently I've been playing through games like Horizon Zero Dawn, Days Gone, God of War, I cannot wait for Returnal, Ghost of Tsushima, the Uncharted Legacy of Thieves collection, and of course The Last of Us Part 1, all to make their way over to PC because my favorite place to play all of these games has been on the Steam Deck in handheld form. And the biggest reason for that is that when I'm playing on the Steam Deck, specifically these Sony games, I feel like I'm playing the PS Vita 2, or at least the ultimate realization of what Sony was trying to do with the PS Vita 1. I bought the PS Vita day one. I actually had a 3DS at the time with the whole Circle Pad Pro attachment that only worked with 2 games, Metal Gear Solid 3 3D, and of course Resident Evil Revelations, and it was cool, but once Resident Evil Revelations came out, I was like, man, do I really even want this 3DS anymore? And you gotta consider the fact that at the time, the 3DS really wasn't getting as many games as it was getting towards the end of its life cycle. It was getting games like every month back then, but when I got my Vita, it was getting like 1 game every 3 to 4 months, and it really didn't seem like it was gonna be this console that took off like the way that it did. And the big reason it even took off was because they lowered the price so much, but regardless, I traded in my 3DS and I was a day one PS Vita adopter. And if you want to talk about consoles that launched with a ton of games, the PS Vita is one of the best. I mean, we had so many games to play on this device, ranging from a full Uncharted game with Uncharted Golden Abyss, all the way down to one of the best puzzle games of all time, Lumines. And you also had stuff like Mod Nation Racers, Marvel vs. Capcom, like the list goes on and on of great games across a bunch of different genres. Like, I don't know why no one bought the PS Vita day one with a launch lineup like it had, but that really was a sign of bad times to come. Where the Vita really took off for me was not with AAA games that felt like you were playing on a PS3, it's with indie games. I played so many indie games on my PS Vita, like Hotline Miami 1 and 2, The Swindler, like there were so many great indie games coming out all the time on this thing, and the coolest thing about them was that if you bought them on PS4 or PS3, you also got the Vita version as well, and you had automatic save transferring with the cloud, and it worked better on that device than it does on even the PS5 or Xbox Series X does today. There were some AAA standouts towards the end though, like Killzone Mercenary was a game I sunk hours and hours into on the multiplayer, and of course stuff like Freedom Wars, which was like Sony's attempt at making a Monster Hunter clone that got pretty damn close. But once the PS Vita got hacked and Sony realized the thing was never really going to generate many sales and it wasn't selling enough games to be profitable, they killed the thing off and moved on from the handheld dream altogether. And that was like a super abridged version of the PS Vita's life cycle. It was like 10 years, so I had to break it down really basically. If you want to look into it more, there are tons of great videos out there, but the real successor to the PS Vita that we have now is the Backbone controller that Sony teamed up with them to make, and yeah, it looks pretty cool. It basically turns your phone into a DualShock, and if you have PS Plus Premium, you can cloud stream games from there, or you can stream them directly from your PS5, and it's cool again, but yeah, I don't know, it's just not really what I was looking for from Sony in terms of a handheld. So like I mentioned, the best option we have right now is definitely the Steam Deck, because all of these games that I've mentioned, like God of War, Days Gone, and Horizon, they all run at original settings at 30 frames per second at 720p, which honestly is around what they were running at on the original PlayStation 4. So long story short, they all look really good. But the console handheld hybrid PC thing that's really made me want a PS Vita the most is the GPD Win 4. So if you take one look at this thing, you can definitely see why it's reminding me of the PlayStation Vita, because it's basically a handheld PC in the PlayStation Vita's chassis, but with a ton of upgrades, like a slide up screen that reminds me of the T-Mobile Sidekick, and when you slide it up, it reveals a touchpad keyboard just like you had on the T-Mobile Sidekick. Another cool thing about this handheld is that it's a graphical powerhouse. Not only is it using a 6800U processor, it's got a Radeon 680M discrete graphics card, which we have not seen in very many handheld PCs. Like even the Steam Deck is using an APU. Of course, it is an RDNA 2 chip, which is like the latest technology from AMD, and it's the technology that runs inside the Xbox Series X and the PlayStation 5, so it does a really good job, but it's going to have some trouble standing up to something like this that has its own dedicated dedicated graphics card. And the 6800U is going to be a great processor because I have a handheld right now, the One X Player Mini, that has a 5800U, and that thing is living up to the Steam Deck as well over on the Windows side. Like, it runs Destiny 2 at medium settings at 30 frames per second flawlessly. I love it. It also comes along with a headphone jack, a USB-A port on the top, and a USB-C port on the top. But you also get a USB-C port on the bottom, and the screen on it is 6 inches, and it looks like it's going to look pretty good. I haven't seen it in real life, so I can't tell you, but everything I've heard about it makes it seem like it's going to look really good. And even though it's using the A, B, X, Y buttons, you can look at that for 2 seconds and immediately see that it has the exact same layout, and it looks like even maybe the same button casings that the PS Vita uses, and they're the clickiest, most tactile buttons I've ever used on a handheld, so if they feel anything like the Vitas, I will be super excited. And unlike the PlayStation Vita, it has 4 triggers, and kind of like the PlayStation Vita, it has a SIM card slot, but this accepts 4G LTE, so you could actually play games on the go with it. There's no official price just yet, but they're saying it's going to retail for under $1,000, which seems pretty good. I've never really messed around with a GPD device before, but from what I've heard, they are pretty reliable, and they've basically been in the handheld PC game the longest when you look at all these companies like Aya Neo, One X Player, and even Valve. So if I'm Sony and I'm seeing all of these handhelds coming out, especially a handheld that looks almost identical to the PlayStation Vita, which still has a very dedicated niche fan base, I think they'd be crazy to not consider making a new handheld. I mean, Valve has already done a lot of the legwork on getting an RDNA 2 chip shrunk down and working in a handheld, and I feel like Sony could go to AMD and be like, hey, why don't you take the chip that you have in the PS5, underclock it a little bit, and put it in a handheld for us? And AMD would sit there like, yeah, we'll totally do that, because people would probably want to buy a PlayStation handheld having seen the Steam Deck and how much success it's had playing full-on AAA games. And if Sony can make a handheld version of the PS5 APU, that would make it easier to port games to this theoretical PS Vita 2, right? Like, you'd have to decrease the settings a little bit, obviously, but if you're running on an 800p screen like what we have on the Steam Deck, you wouldn't have to decrease them that much. And I would imagine that you could even pull a rock solid 30 frames per second out of it at normal settings at around 800p, or if you wanted to get 60 FPS, you could build in FSR and lower the resolution, just like the Steam Deck does. And if you're optimizing the game for one chip and then optimizing it for the handheld chip, I would imagine that a lot of these games would run a lot better on a Sony handheld than they would even on the Steam Deck. Because as awesome as all of these games are on the Steam Deck, you're still dealing with the quality of the PC port. And even though games like God of War have a perfect PC port, games like Horizon Zero Dawn do not have a perfect PC port, and after years and years of updates, it's still vastly inferior to even the PS4 version other than the frame rate. And having a handheld like this would be a great way just to keep people within the Sony ecosystem, because even though they sell these games on PC and they sell them at pretty big numbers, they put them all up for lower than full retail price for around $50, and before they even come out, you can usually get them for around $40 from Green Man Gaming. And on top of all of that, for every copy they sell on Steam, they have to give Valve 30% of their take. So for gamers who have a PC and a PlayStation 5, I think the vast majority of them end up buying these games on PC, even though they have to wait, because they can get them so much cheaper. And not only is Sony making less money because they're selling them cheaper, they're making less money again because they're paying Valve 30%. So if they had a handheld where they said, hey, if you buy this game digitally, you'll not only get the PC copy on our new launcher, you'll also get a digital handheld copy on our handheld, and that would be great, because even though they're not making the full price sale on the new version of the game for the handheld, they'll make money when people buy DLC on the PlayStation Store versus buying it on Steam. And they'll make money when people buy the game in the first place on the PlayStation Store, where they get 100% of the revenue. Also, another huge way on which they can improve over the Steam Deck is by baking in the adaptive triggers and the haptic feedback from the DualSense. Like, the Steam Deck barely has rumble. It's there, but it's so slight and so hard to feel that I've honestly considered turning it off multiple times, because I'm sure it's drawing battery power and I can't even feel it, so why use it? Whereas with the DualSense, the features on that thing with the adaptive triggers and the haptic feedback, that's like the biggest selling point of next-gen games on the PS5, because pretty much every game we have on that thing is also available on PS4 and only gets a minor upgrade when you play it on the next-gen console. That controller controller just takes it to the next level. So if Sony just made a Steam Deck with an RDNA 2 chip and also haptic feedback and adaptive triggers, that would basically make the Steam Deck look like a toy. And then the final nail they could drive into the Steam Deck's coffin would be obviously an OLED screen. I mean, that was one of the coolest and biggest selling points of the original PlayStation Vita, was that games looked so good on that screen, even though it was under 720p, because it was an OLED screen and a lot of the games on it were able to run at that resolution. So if they're able to get the PS5 chip shrunk down and able to keep these games at 800p with an OLED screen, it's going to look absolutely incredible. And I think at that point, with the same AAA games you're getting on the PS5, people would really want to buy this console versus what happened with the PS Vita, which was like getting inferior games to what you'd have on the PS3 or PS4. A theoretical PS Vita 2, like the one I'm talking about here, would also help Sony fight off Xbox with their cheaper Series S, because they could add a dock to it, right? Like if they're adding in an RDNA 2 chip and they can keep the RAM about the same as what's in the PS5, and they just have to reduce the settings a little bit to get it to run at 800p, it would be sick if when you dock this thing on the official included PlayStation dock, you could just connect a DualSense to it and then you have a lower powered PS5. Like if they could get games to run at like 1080p or around where the Switch does at 900p, yes, that would be a noticeable drop off from what you're seeing between the digital and disc editions of the PS5, but you would basically have the ultimate PlayStation device, because not only can you play it on the TV with the DualSense and take advantage of all those features, you can take it off the dock and take it on the go and use it as a straight up handheld, just like the Nintendo Switch. And the big key here is that the games would be exactly the same on this device as the ones on the PS5. So you would buy one game, like I said, digitally on the PlayStation Store, and you would get it on the PS Vita 2, you would get it on the PS5, and you would get a free copy on the PC. I mean, that would probably get a ton of people who buy their games on Steam to heavily consider not only buying a PlayStation handheld, but also a PlayStation 5, and they could just keep their PC because all of the games they're buying are included there as well. So not only is Sony making money from the PC players on the game, they're going to make money when these people go out and buy a PS5, and they're going to make even more money when all these people go out and buy a PS Vita 2. This is just something that I really want because I travel a lot, and the reason I end up buying most of my games on PC is because I have a pretty beefy gaming laptop. So when I travel, I can take my AAA big powerful games on the go and just play them on my laptop screen. So if I had a PlayStation handheld where I could transfer my saves and my games back and forth just by buying them once, I would basically be done with PC gaming, right? Like I could just play everything on PlayStation. And it's crazy to me that a company like Sony, with the quality of the games that they've been producing lately, isn't looking into something like this, especially when you consider that they just bought Bungie, who's making live service games. And if you want people to keep playing live service games, you got to make them easy to access. So while yes, I'm sure they're looking at making them easy to access on a phone, it would be awesomer if they made it easy to access on a brand new PlayStation handheld. So long story short, to wrap this all up here, I think Sony's crazy to not be working on a PS Vita 2. And when you see what companies like GPD are doing, what companies like Valve are doing, who have a much smaller market cap than Sony as a whole, it makes it even crazier to consider why the hell aren't they making one. So that's what I want from the PS Vita 2. I'd love to hear what you want from it down in the comments below. And remember, subscribe and set your notifications to all if you want to see more PlayStation videos.